Okay, so we're going to look at Acts. And so last week you did Luke. Is that correct? So you're all experts on Luke. And you looked at things like who wrote this book, I hope. Why? Okay, you tell me. This is where I'm going to be mean. Okay, why do you think Luke wrote Luke's gospel? Well, perhaps you don't. What's the evidence you have? Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Luke's probably the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. He wrote more of the New Testament than anybody else. Actual number of words. Not so many books as Paul, but actually more words, more portion of the book. So once you've done Luke Acts, you've actually done the biggest chunk of the New Testament. That's encouraging, isn't it? So yeah. Okay. Why else? Why Luke? Why not somebody else? What's your evidence? Because one of the problems with the Gospels and Acts, it doesn't tell us, does it? You know, Paul's letters all start with the same word, Paul. But Luke, when you come to the Gospels, they're anonymous. It says the Gospel according to whoever at the top, but that's tradition, isn't it? So perhaps they got it wrong. Who knows? So why Luke? Yeah, we have evidence from the church file. There's lots and lots of that. That's part of the evidence we have. Well, that's called external evidence. To use the SBS jargon. You know, one of the fun things when you start SBSs in different countries, you have to decide what you're going to call the different things in that language. Like what you're going to call a segment and a section and a division in that language. So there's no ambiguity about it. So all sorts of things you have to think about. And it's fun the first time you see a set of charts in a completely new language. I remember seeing the very first ever set of Russian charts. I couldn't understand a word of it, but it looks impressive. It was just getting around. Anyway, so authorship. Let's have a look for a moment at the very first bit of Luke. You've probably looked at this the other day, and I want us to make that connection between Luke and Acts. Okay, so this is the beginning of Luke, and this is what it says. Which version are you using? Are you using English Standard or this is NRSV? This is what we used to use a little bit in the old days. When I did the SV, it was the old RSV with all of these and thous in it. Anyway, so this is what it says, beginning of Luke. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you've been instructed. Now, when you read that, what's the impression you get? It's a letter, yeah, but just about the language. Did you notice that's really formal language? Actually, you know, in the Greek language, there's basically two styles of Greek. There's the ordinary everyday Greek, Koine Greek, which is the Greek they'll talk down the marketplace, just the ordinary people would talk. That's what the New Testament's written in. The everyday language. So it would be Nuneaton-ish. Or Cockney London, you know, or whatever. That will be what the New Testament will be in. Now, the Greek philosophers, like, you know, Plato and these guys, they wrote in classical Greek, which was much more sort of formal, elaborate language. And this beginning of Luke's Gospel is written in full-blown classical Greek. It's the only bit of the New Testament that is. And I think he's doing it partly deliberately. Because what he does, it's interesting, Luke, when you read on into the birth narratives, what he does then, through those next 2 or 3 chapters, he uses Greek, which is very similar to the Greek that was used when they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. So it was sort of a Jewish type of Greek. And then when you come into the actual ministry of Jesus, after about chapter 4 or so, he goes into ordinary, Koine, everyday Greek. So it does like a sort of transition in the language there. It's quite interesting. You'd only know that, really, if you're a Greek expert, which I'm not. But anyway, I think even in English, you can tell those first few verses are really formal. Now, a couple of things to point out here. First of all, he's writing this for you, most excellent Theophilus. Now, this could be just a dedication, You know, if you read some of these older books in English, even it always says "for my mother" or something. Have you seen that in these older books? It's always your mum. It's never your dad. It's always your mum. For my mother, or for my, for some, or some. It could be some person who's given some money to help you write that book. And this could be the situation. This could be somebody who basically gave Luke a bit of cash so he could write the book. We don't know. But the thing is, you see, did you notice the title it uses for Theophilus? Most excellent. Now, you've read Acts. Is there anybody in the book of Acts who is addressed most excellent? Did you notice that? This is a bit of a mean question. Let's test your Bible knowledge and Bible observation. Was there anybody addressed most excellent? No, not Claudius. Claudius, I don't think. You're warm. It wasn't Claudius, it was somebody else. And I'll give you the hint of the reference. It's 26:25, and it was Festus. Festus was the Roman governor. Now, to be a Roman governor, you had to be quite high up in Roman society. Later on, I'm going to give you a little slideshow, and on there, I've got a bit about the social classes in Roman society, which is quite interesting, because it was very rigid. And if you wanted to become a governor of a province, you had to come from what was called the equestrian class. That's to do with horses. It was like one down from the Senate. You had the senatorial class, which was like the top, below the emperor. And then next one down was the equestrian class. And then normally the governors would be from that class of people. And that's how they would be addressed. Most excellent. So if this Theophilus is a real person, which we don't know, he could be just a made-up name. Because basically Theophilus means person who loves God. Theo, God. Philos, love. So, person who loves God. So it could be not his real name. We don't know. But he's given that title, most excellent, which would suggest that he's some sort of person who's a high up position in the Roman Empire. Now the question is, why on earth is Luke writing this gospel and the book of Acts to this person in this high up position in the Roman Empire? It's an interesting question. Let's turn to the beginning of Acts and we'll see how this links together. So let's look at the first couple of verses here. And it says, in the first book, Theophilus, I wrote all about all that Jesus did and taught from the beginning until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles who he had chosen. See how he links it together? In the first book, he's referring back to this previous book he'd written, the book of Luke, also written to Theophilus. So Theophilus appears there in both of them. Notice how he says that he taught in the first book what Jesus taught from the beginning, right through his ministry up until the time of his ascension. And really, what the book of Acts does is continue the story. Okay? So he makes that connection. There was one thing that puzzles me. I always wondered this, and if anybody has the answer to this, it'd be interesting. Well, how come Luke and Acts don't come next to each other in the Bible? If they're two parts of the same story, why don't we have Luke Acts next to each other? Like you have 1 Kings, 2 Kings, or, why don't we have Luke Acts together? I don't know. Why have they put John in between? Maybe because it's written a bit later. And they put it in between so they can keep the Gospels together. Interesting thoughts, isn't it? One of the things you find as you study the Bible, how many of you came here and say, I want to have all my questions answered? Did you have that thought when you come here? I want to come to the SBS and I want to find out everything I could possibly know about the Bible and have all my questions answered. Did you think something like that? And what have you found so far? There's an awful lot more questions you haven't even thought of. And you normally end the SBS with more questions in your mind than when you came. But that's fine. That's all part of learning, isn't it? And that's what we're called to in Christian ministry, really. And in the life of studying the Bible, we're called to be perpetual students. You never graduate from the SBS, you know that? You just graduate onto the free one. It starts at the end of this one. It goes on for the rest of your life as you continue to use these tools you've been given this year to continue your studies and learn how to use it, pass it on. One of the great things we need desperately is people who can teach. Desperate need. And I always say this to SBS students. You've got that sort of little thing inside that says, I want to teach this. I always remember when I was on the SBS, I was sitting down here somewhere, and I remember looking at the staff and thinking, I'd love to do that one day. And then when we got to the very last week of the New Testament, Dr. Elmore, 20 hours of videos on the Book of Revelation, I said, I'd love to do that. I'd love to be able to teach the Book of Revelation. That's a little dream that God gave me a few years later. And I think for the last 25 years, I've been teaching the Book of Revelation. So that's probably the one I teach most often. It's often the one that's needed in different places. And so listen to that little voice inside you that says, I'd love to do that. Because it's not going to come from the devil, is it? No, I don't think it's going to say, yeah, I really think you ought to go and teach the Bible somewhere. I really don't think so. I think it's only God who's into that sort of idea. And but we need that. We need people who can go and teach. And it doesn't have to be big groups. Because often people are really scared of teaching big groups. It can be one-on-one. That's not very scary, is it? Is it scary talking to one other person? No, not normally. Or a small group. We desperately need that. The churches in England and all around the world are desperately, desperately short of people who can teach. So be thinking. It's a long time to the end of the school, but I'm looking ahead. Okay, so where have we got to? Have you got this little handout, by the way? Great. Because this is basically like a little summary of what we'll talk about to start with here. Okay, so how about a date? What sort of date did you come up with for Luke? In the 80s. Quite late, yeah. Anybody else think something else? Yeah. Late 60s? Yeah, could be. Okay, yeah. Okay. Now, if Luke was written before the book of Acts, which seems to be suggesting if you read the beginning of Acts, when does Acts finish? Do you know the date at the end of the book of Acts? 60 to 62. Okay, key dates. One thing we'll learn a bit as we go through all this is pick out some good dates. Okay. That's around that period was when Paul was in prison in Rome. 2 years, it says he was there, living at his own expense. He wasn't really in prison. He was in the house. There was a soldier guarding him and receiving visitors. Later on, Paul was put in prison in a dungeon when he wrote 2 Timothy, around the time of just after the fire of Rome and Nero's persecution. Are you beginning to put together the jigsaw of these sort of events of the New Testament? That's what you tend to do. When you first start off with all this, you sort of information overload. But what you need to do is gradually put the pieces together. And that's why doing a timeline is really helpful. But one thing we'll do as you look at the book of Acts, we'll begin to put in some key historical events which actually anchor the book of Acts into history. One of the things I've always really appreciated about studying the Bible is that we're not studying a book full of fairy stories. The Bible connects in very little details into history, into culture, into geography. At one time, it was quite fashionable amongst liberal scholars to criticize Luke and say that Luke was not a very good historian. They've had to eat their words because they've actually proved now that Luke was one of the best historians we have. He's incredibly accurate. And I'll show you, as we go, we're going to have a slideshow later on, I'll show you some of the places where he's unbelievably accurate in his history. He would only know that if he'd been there. And I'll show you some of those. But as I said, something that always means a lot to me is the fact that this book we read, this Bible, is rooted in history. It connects in. I remember a few years ago, there was quite an interesting discovery made. You're going to go down to the British Museum later on. But probably about 10 years ago now, there was a guy in the British Museum down in the basement. And they have all sorts of stuff down in the basement, about 10 times the amount of stuff that ever gets put upstairs. And a whole load of it is from the Assyrians in cuneiform, in this very old script. Now, there's about 6 people around the world who can read cuneiform. And one of these people was visiting the British Museum, and he picked up a little tablet about this size and read it. And it was a tax return. You think, oh, that's a bit boring, isn't it? It was a tax return from a guy called Nabor Ushu Siku or something. And he said, wow, he's in the book of Jeremiah. And that's very impressive, isn't it? But it was. That name is actually there in the book of Jeremiah. And it's amazing this guy knew that. It's one of the sort of obscure names mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, which tends to have lots and lots of names in it anyway. And actually, it made quite an interesting impact on these fairly unbelieving scholars in the British Museum. And the comments were made, if the Bible is accurate with these so insignificant little names, perhaps it's a bit more trustworthy than we thought. But that's the thing that really excites me, and always I appreciate it. And you'll probably enjoy going around the British Museum and seeing everything there. Anyway, so as I said, Luke tended to be very criticised as a historian. And actually, what they've discovered recently is that the sea voyage we have at the book of Acts, chapter 27 and 28, is actually one of the best descriptions we have anywhere of Roman ships and Roman sailing in all of Greco-Roman literature. What we have in chapter 27 and 28 of Acts is about the best description anywhere of a sea voyage. Bit of a risky one, but so Luke can be trusted. Okay, so have you looked at the structure of Acts? Have you done your horizontal? How did you organize it? What are your main divisions? How did you break up the book? And what approach did you take? Sorry? The places, geography. Well, you find different books, you see, split up in different ways. You know, Luke tends to love geography. Did you notice that as you read through, he sort of describes every little tiny little island they go past. Totally insignificant, really. Oh, we went past this one, we went past this one. It's a real eyewitness, isn't it? You know, and did you notice other places where they cover a few hundred miles in about 2 verses? Because Luke wasn't there. By the way, I want to just throw a little idea out about Paul's missionary journeys. You're going to draw these on the map, and you look at the back of the Bible, and there they all are. I begin to wonder sometimes whether they're not quite accurate. You think, what heresy is he coming up with here? Now, one thing you'll find, if you look in different places in the New Testament, as you read Paul's letters, you'll find he refers sometimes to visits to other places which are not mentioned in the book of Acts. Now, when you read Romans, you'll come to chapter 15 of Romans, and it says he's preached the gospel from Jerusalem as far as Illyricum. Now, where's Illyricum? Well, Illyricum is right up here. It's basically where Croatia and Serbia are now. Now, at no point in the book of Acts, or particularly before about chapter 20 of the book of Acts, where he wrote Romans, does he go up that far north. So sometime in one of those journeys before the third one, because it's the third one when he wrote Romans, so it was obviously in the past, he must have gone up north there. So what we have to realize when we read Acts is that Luke is being very selective. You know, they call it the Acts of the Apostles. But in some ways, it's some of the Acts of some of the Apostles, with a particular emphasis on 2 people. Who are they? Peter and Paul. Did you notice that? How it began? First part of the book up to about chapter 10 or 11. Who's the main focus? It's really Peter, isn't it? Paul suddenly appears when Stephen gets stoned, and then you get his conversion. And then from 13 onwards, it's like Peter fades out, and Paul becomes the focus of attention. And that can be another way of splitting up the book, by the way. You know, one thing you'll find with studying the SBS, and this is a nice heretical statement the staff will get into big trouble for. There's no such thing as a perfect horizontal. Okay? And you can justify splitting up the book in different ways. If you want to split it up by people, that's perfectly okay. Now, what you'll find is that sometimes one way of dividing it is more prominent than another. But the danger is that you can ignore it. And I think with that, you do have this contrast between Peter and Paul. And I think there's a reason for it. Because, so what was your key verse? You got a key verse yet? But basically what you have in there is the story of the gospel expanding from Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the earth. So it's like that geographical expansion. Now, by the way, this is a little interesting thing to think about. Back in the first century, in the Roman society, where are the ends of the earth? No. No. Do you know where the ends of the earth were in the first century? England. England was the ends of the earth. And you look at the map of the Roman Empire, where's at the end of the world? The little state, that bit up there called Britannia. You know, beyond that, what have you got? You've got the Atlantic Ocean. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Tell you other fun things. Have you ever looked into this whole thing about how the gospel came to England? And when? Most people always assume it came here much later than it did. The gospel came to England first century. First century, about 55. Around the time Paul wrote Romans, the gospel was in England. Down near where we live in Herefordshire, about 2 hours away. Well, today it was about 3 hours. The trains were slow. But if you ever been down towards Bristol, down towards the southwest, you go down the big motorway, the M5, and there's a big line of hills as you go down after Birmingham called the Malvern Hills. And we live just the other side of those. We can see them where we live. And the bottom end of the Malvern Hills, there's a big hill with all sorts of ridges on it called British Camp. And it's an old Iron Age settlement, which was eventually defeated by the Romans. And the guy who lived there was a guy called Caractacus. And, sorry? Caradog, yes, Caradog in Welsh, or Caractacus in English. And basically, there's a very fascinating story about how he got to, I can't remember the details now, but basically what happened, he got betrayed and captured by the Romans and taken to Rome and made this very impassioned speech asking for clemency before the emperor. And he was so impressed with his speech, he let him off and basically made him a prisoner in Rome. But his family then lived in Rome and heard the gospel and brought it back to England in the 50s. Isn't that great? So that's the ends of the earth. So next time you read Acts 1 verse 8, think of the ends of the earth and you'll think that's where we are here. But in the book of Acts, it's describing the expansion of the gospel, but only really in one direction. Where does it all begin in the book of Acts? It all begins in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the heart of Judaism. It was the place where the temple was and where the Jews were, the land, the promised land and everything else. And where does it end up? In Rome. So basically the story of having the book of Acts is the gospel moving from the Jewish center here in Jerusalem to the center of the Gentile world here in Rome. Now at the same time the book of Acts was describing, the gospel was also being spread in other directions, which we don't hear about in the book of Acts. You know, the gospel came down here to Egypt, came along North Africa. It went east. By the end of the first century, it reached India. They still have the Thomas churches in India today. And it's spread up into Central Asia and into what's now the Arabic world. But that's not described in Luke. See, Luke's being very selective. He's describing the spread of the gospel from the center of Judaism to the center of the Gentile world. And that's why I think he does this transfer from Peter to Paul. You see, Peter was the apostle to the Jews. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. You remember, you've done Galatians, haven't you? You haven't done Galatians yet? Oh, we always used to do Galatians, second book, first week of the school. Philemon, Galatians, Titus, and Mark, we used to do. Have you changed what you do then? Okay, Ephesians. Yeah. You know why we used to do Galatians? You know why? Very good reason why. One of the troubles with doing the SBS is you have this thing called grading. And sometimes people react the wrong way to grading. You get into performance. Oh, I've got to do well, I've got to do well, I've got to do well, I've got to do well. And you get into the big stressy thing, you know. You've got to get 100% for everything, you know. And you want to perform and you want to do. So that's why I had Galatians right at the beginning, all about grace. You know, God loves you even if you don't do any charts. Oh, another heresy. But you got to live that. You've got to live in that grace. You know, that's why we just put Galatians earlier on, so you get that real message of grace. And then you get Titus, you see, that the grace leads to good works. So there's a reason in that thinking. Anyway, so Maury used to have Ephesians at the beginning. He used to Ephesians rather than Titus. But anyway, people do different things. You know, once I actually did Revelation to teach inductive Bible study. Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because we actually went to start the school up in Norway, and up near Trondheim, 63 degrees north. This time of year it gets dark about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and light again about 10 o'clock the next morning. Anyway, so we decided to open up the Revelation Week as a seminar for the general public. And I thought what we'll do, because we've been part of this SBS, they can get them to come a day early and teach some inductive Bible study before we do Revelation. I thought, well, what we'll do, we'll use Revelation to teach inductive Bible study. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Because it illustrates so well the power of asking the right questions, which most people never do. In the book of Revelation, like, what type of literature is it? What was going on in those certain churches in Asia and this sort of thing. All the questions you're familiar with, hopefully be getting familiar with. But it actually works really, really well. So that's an interesting one for next time. Start with the book of Revelation. That would be a radical, different way of doing the SBS. What do you think about one, Andy? They weren't. See, the people coming to the seminar, they weren't doing the whole school. They were just coming here for a week. But it was interesting. One thing you find with the SBS, it's unbelievably flexible. You can take what we have here and you can repackage it and do anything you like with it. Don't necessarily call it an SBS, but because what we're teaching is inductive Bible study and how to. There's all sorts of different ways of communicating that. Okay, so Luke was being very selective. Now, did you notice some places in the book where the pronoun changed? Did you notice that? So it's often called the we passages. Now, if you're Scottish, we passages mean, oh, they're little teeny ones, little small ones. Anybody from Scotland here? I'm partly Scottish. My grandma was a Scot. So we had the Scottish base leader at one point who used to joke about the we passages. But we means us, not them, not small. Okay. But what happens? What you find? You look out for them. I'm not going to tell you where they are, but I want you to spot them and mark them on your chart. Well, you're not doing charts, not on your horizontal or something. But because what you have there, that's where Luke joins the story. And there's different places in the book where he's there, and then he seems to disappear again, and then he comes back. And what you'll find when Luke is there, you get a huge amount of detail. And then when he's not there, you hardly get anything at all. You know, one thing I tried to do once, but I didn't get very far with this, was actually try and calculate how far Paul travelled. Actually, in kilometres or miles. It's thousands. It's thousands. And, of course, as I said, he went to other places as well. There's one point, when he's in Ephesus, in chapter 19, he actually goes to visit Corinth. But it's not mentioned in Acts. When you read 2 Corinthians, he mentions that. So there's all sorts of other bits of the journeys as well, like going up to Illyricum, which aren't mentioned. So just the ones you have in Acts, you're talking about thousands of miles. Now, the other thing, of course, to appreciate, as far as the history is concerned, is that this time, this whole massive area of territory was all under the power of Rome. What do they call it? The Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it was only for this period, for the next 300 years or so, that Europe was like that. What happened after that? He degenerated into the Dark Ages and continued fighting each other almost continuously ever since. And this was a period of relative peace, but also relatively easy travel. Have you been out the front gate here? Looked along the A5? Do you notice it's quite straight? It's called Watling Street. It was the Romans built that road. Well, actually, some people reckon it was pre-Roman, but it's a Roman road. If you look at the map of England, Watling Street from here to London is straight. You drive down the A5. If you don't go on the M1, go down the old A5. For a long way, it just goes straight, 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 straight. And if you go down the road here a little bit, about just after Hinckley, you come to a little place called High Cross. As you go down the A5, you hardly notice it, because it's there that the Roman road called the Fosse Way crosses the Watling Street. And the Romans said that's the middle of England. They were about 3 miles out, which is quite remarkable, isn't it? Somebody tried to calculate the middle of England. You know where they put it? In the field next door. And so travel was relatively safe and relatively easy at that time, which it was not before, and it was not later. So it really was the fact that the gospel came at a very significant time in history, where it was able to be spread remarkably quickly. And people travelled a lot around the empire. Maybe helpful just to talk a little bit about travel, actually. As I said, they had a good road system. The Romans were quite good at sort of protecting the roads from bandits and things like this. You know, there's quite a famous bandit up the road here later on called Dick Turpin. He came from the village just up here and hung out on the A5 and Watling Street and sort of tended to shoot people up and rob them and things like that. But the Romans were quite good at actually removing these people. So it was actually relatively safe to travel. And of course, the roads originally would have been built for transporting their military, their soldiers, but ordinary people could use them too. And a lot of these roads are still in use today, if you look at the map of England and other places around Europe. So it's quite remarkable. Also, Greek was the main language in the eastern part. So anywhere you went in the eastern half, anywhere east of Italy really, people would understand Greek. And then when you went to the western part, people would understand Latin. So there was like an ease of language communication as well. They also had a single currency. Sounds a bit like the EU, doesn't it? But travel was relatively easy, relatively safe. Sea journeys, by the way, were quite risky. You did not want to travel across the Mediterranean on a boat in the winter. And that's what happened to Paul and his friends on the way to Rome. They tried to land in Crete and couldn't manage it because they got swept away by the winds. And it says they nearly landed in the Syrtis. You know, that's right down here. Paul actually landed up almost down here and then managed to get across to Malta. The Syrtis was down here. It's actually still called Sirte today in Libya. It's where Colonel Gaddafi came from. So Colonel Gaddafi's hometown is actually mentioned in the Book of Acts. Anyway, so they landed up in Malta, but this is very rough. And so normally what happened, if you wanted to travel, they didn't have a ferry service. So you couldn't go down to, the port and wait for the next ferry going to Rome. Pay your money and the ferry will go. What you have to do, you'd have to wait in the harbour until you could find somebody who'd be willing to take you somewhere vaguely in the right direction. So if you look at Paul's journey to Rome, for example, he actually went on about 3 different boats on the way to Rome, because you go, there's one going up here somewhere, so let's go there. And then, there's another one going over here somewhere, let's get that one. And what would happen, you sort of negotiate with the captain of the boat to take you as a passenger. And they would normally be carrying, cargo as their main thing. And so basically you'd have to pay your own way. They wouldn't feed you. And normally what would happen, boats at that time, they weren't very keen on going right out into the middle of the ocean, the sea here. So they'd normally keep to the coast, keep in sight of the coast all the time. And each night they would go into a harbour for the night. And then the passengers would then have to go ashore, find something to eat, because they wouldn't get it on the boat. And normally find somewhere to stay as well. So that's what sea travel was like. And as I said, trying to do any time after this time of year onwards will be very risky. The Mediterranean can get surprisingly stormy. Anyway, it's a little bit about travel. But the distances they covered are really quite remarkable. Okay, if you pick up their handout, I'm not going to go through this in detail because you can read this yourself. I put here, there's a section here about the structure Major character, Peter Paul. Geographic expansion of the gospel, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, at the ends of the earth. But also, some people have noticed that through the book are these sort of little brief summary statements. Sometimes people call them progress reports. Let me show you an example of one. 6 verse 7. And it says this. It says, the word of God continued to spread. The number of disciples increased greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests came obedient to the faith. That's rather interesting, isn't it? All the priests got saved. But if you look on that list there's a number of these through the book, and some people have actually used those to do the structure of the book. There's another one for you. Now, the other thing I've got on here is different features of Luke's style. And geography we've noticed, of course. Did you notice that in the gospel as well? His interest in geography and history, how he placed Jesus' birth during the reigns of these different rulers, and the ministry of John the Baptist too. Repetition. Did you notice you get Paul's testimony 3 times? It's interesting little comparisons there as he tells, Luke tells actually what happens, and then how Paul then tells that to different people as well. Interchange. Remember interchange, A, B, A, B? You get that number of times, so look out for that. Contrasts. Do you notice the contrast in chapter 4 and 5 between Barnabas and Ananias and Sapphira? Barnabas was one who sold a field and gave the money to the apostles. Ananias and Sapphira sold something, kept some money back, pretended they gave it all. Interesting, that story. What did they do wrong? They didn't have to sell their field, whatever it was. They didn't have to give it all to the apostles. They lied about it, you see. They tried to make out it was all of it when it wasn't. Anyway, understatement. This is a very typical Luke. You get, do you notice in chapter 15 when you have the Council of Jerusalem? And basically what happened, you see, the big argument really was something that the church really struggled with all the way through the book of Acts, by the way, in the early decades of the church. How can Gentiles come to faith? And this is really the background of Galatians as well. And you see some people coming along and saying, well, you know, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. And if you want to believe in the Jewish Messiah, you need to become a Jew. Because, you know, you could become a Jew. It was quite a lengthy process, and for the men, a bit painful. That's why you tend to get more women converts to Judaism than men, very practical reasons. You get a lot of people, by the way, in Acts who are called God-fearers. Do you notice those? These were Gentile, like Cornelius was an example, a God-fearer, somebody who feared God, who believed in the one true God, would go to the synagogue, give money to the synagogue, but the one thing they did not want to do is to have the snip. Okay? Very basic, isn't it? But you see, you get a lot of women who are converts. So it was quite possible, even though it was a bit difficult and a bit of a long process, for a Gentile to become a Jew. Basically, it meant a complete cut to your previous life, literally, you know, cut off from your previous existence. You're giving a new name. You'd be baptized in water as a washing, and then circumcision for the guys. And then you'd have to agree to come under the law. And there's a number of comments about, you know, in the Gospels about the Pharisees going out and proselytizing. Anyway, so the big question, you see, is when Gentiles started to respond to Jesus, what are we going to do? And Cornelius is a real key story. Because what you have there is, sometimes it's called the Gentile Pentecost. You know, you've got Pentecost in chapter 2, the coming of the Holy Spirit, they were all Jews. No problems, okay? Now, what the apostles got into trouble for doing was going out and preaching the gospel to the Gentiles. And there was a struggle within the believers. Some people were hard line and said, no, you can't do that. Others were, like Paul, he had that revelation of grace that the gospel was also for the Gentiles. And what was happening is, you see, Paul went off and preached the gospel and saw people come to faith up in Galatia and other places, up central Turkey. And then Judaizers would come along and say, well, no, Paul was teaching really what was a fairly easy gospel. He just wants to please you. He was just saying an easy message. You know, if you really want to be serious about following God and believing in Jesus, you really need to become a Jew first. That was the argument. And in chapter 15, they thrashed this out. The Council of Jerusalem. And Luke describes it as no small dissension. What's that basically mean? They had a huge row. In chapter 27, there was no small tempest. In other words, a huge storm big enough to shipwreck you. Have you ever been in a storm that size? I have. For a little while after I finished university, I worked on the ships. And we went on a big container ship from England out to Australia, went to Melbourne and Sydney, and then went to New Zealand, Auckland, Wellington, Lyttelton, South Island. Then we came straight back from South Island, New Zealand, to London via Cape Horn, around the bottom of South America. So I've probably been further south than any of you have ever been. Anybody been here to Antarctica? Because you have to go there to get further south than I've been. Okay, we're going across the South Pacific from New Zealand to Cape Horn. I've never ever seen sea like it. We were on a big ship. It was about 100 feet from the bridge of the ship down to the sea level. The waves were above us. This ship was, small in modern day container ships. We carried 2,000 containers, and literally this ship was being thrown around. It was really quite scary, actually. And then I realized we used to send the weather reports in every day. And the same day would get back the same weather report that we'd sent in. In other words, there were not any other boats down that part of the world. At one point, I looked at the map, and I realized the nearest bit of land was about 2,000 miles away, and that was Antarctica. So if we got shipwrecked, we had no chance. And actually, while we were going across there, it was so rough that the front end of the ship, the front row of containers, was completely shredded by the waves. That's the storm. No small tempest, as Luke would say. It was definitely a bit scary. You look up there and there's these massive waves and the ship was all over the place. And big one as well. So that's no small tempest. Understatement. It's the opposite of hyperbole. Oh yeah, principality, emphasis and de-emphasis. You'll find there's certain things, Luke, where he really emphasizes them, like Pentecost, like Paul's conversion, the story of Cornelius, you get that twice. The Paul's trials, the journey to Rome. These are big amount of spaces given to them. Other times, he covers about 1,000 miles in about 2 verses. If you look at the beginning of chapter 20, let's look at that just to see how far he goes in beginning of chapter 20. Yeah. Okay, I want to just have a look, see how far he's going in about 3 verses. So at the end of chapter 19, he's in Ephesus. So have a look, see what Ephesus is on the map. Round about there somewhere. After the uproar, this is the riot in Ephesus, had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them and saying all very well, he left for Macedonia. Where's Macedonia? Okay, up here, Thessalonica, that sort of way. How far is that? A couple 100 miles at least. Do you think miles or kilometres? You're in England, you need to think miles. Okay? When we go abroad, we have to think kilometres, so when you come here, you can think miles. By the way, a lot of countries used to have miles. Do you have them in Sweden? Yeah, we had the Norwegian. You had in Norway, you had the Norwegian mile. 10 kilometres, yeah, you had the same one in Norway. Because they said, it's only a mile. It's 10 kilometres, 6 miles. I thought, why are they talking about miles anyway? But if you look on old maps, you'll find you have the distances in the old units there as well. Anyway, so he's gone to Macedonia. Verse 2. After he'd gone through those regions and given the believers much encouragement, he came to Greece. So he's gone from Macedonia down to Greece. So probably down to Athens or Corinth or somewhere, where he stayed for 3 months. He was about to set sail for Syria. That's a bit in the news. After a plot was made against him, he didn't actually go there, so he decided to return through Macedonia. Okay, so he's back up to Macedonia. So in 3 verses, he's gone from Ephesus to Macedonia to Greece, back to Macedonia. That's not far off 1,000 miles. That's called de-emphasis. See, Luke wasn't there, so you go to get all the details. Now what you find is that in verse 5, it suddenly says, we sailed. And then you get all the little details. Every little island went past. And how one of them got off and walked across the island while the others went by boat and this sort of thing. All sorts of interesting little incidental details, really. Okay, comparison between Peter and Paul. Things to look out for there. That's all on there as well. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Ephesus. Definitely worth it. The core course in Lausanne do this on location school, and they invited me to join them in Turkey. We went to Ephesus, which was great. And then last year, I was invited to teach on the school in Russia. They said, actually, we're in Israel. And so I had to fly to Israel to go and teach on the Russian school, which was really interesting. And what was rather interesting, we stayed in Haifa for the first few days. Haifa is full of Russians. We stayed in a Russian Messianic Jewish church. And we go around the corner to the supermarket. It's all in Russian. And all the food is Russian. But actually think, hang on, we're in Israel. But that was another good opportunity. Okay, so as I said, back at that time, Rome ruled. And so it's helpful to get to know some of these provinces because they get mentioned in the New Testament. Asia. Asia was not Asia as we know it today. Asia is just Western Turkey. That's why they still call it Asia Minor. Galatia up here, on this sort of area. Some of the places are still the same. Syria, Cyprus, Crete. So Achaia, or Greece, is only the southern part. Then the northern part is called Macedonia. There's a big argument here. But here, a few years ago, I went to teach a couple of DTS in Macedonia. Now, the Greeks do like the Macedonians calling their country Macedonia, because Macedonia is part of Greece. So the Macedonians, by edict of the United Nations, had to call their country former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to distinguish it from the Greek Macedonia. Anyway, did you know that? Beautiful place, by the way. If you want somewhere really scenic, go down to the bottom of the Balkans here. It's fantastic scenery. Very unknown. As we went to a place called Ohrid, Macedonia. Beautiful location. It's on the road, actually. And going through there. Paul probably went there. Anyway, so get to know these different places. This is one we went to quite recently. Corsica. We went on holiday there weeks ago. And family holiday in Corsica. Never been before. Beautiful place. Scenic. Amazing scenery and beaches and things like that. Okay, so get familiar with the Roman provinces. Okay, so all begins in Jerusalem. Now, if you go to Israel today, you can go to the Israel Museum. Definitely recommended. Went there and took about 100 photos. And one of these is this one here. That's not my photo, but this is a model of Jerusalem as it was in the first century. And it's apparently. And here we have the temple. Have you looked at the whole layout of the temple at all? So you're fairly familiar with it. Let me just remind you of a few places as we look in the book of Acts. So as you came up into the temple, you would come up into this porch here. This porch was about twice the height of the King's Lodge. The temple courtyard there could hold about 250,000 people. It's huge. And if you go to Jerusalem today, you can see how big it was, because you've got the Temple Mount still there, even though the temple's been destroyed. So you come in here, and these porches went right round like they do over here. But the one over this side was called Solomon's Porch. And that's where the early church met. Now, anybody could come in to the court of the Gentiles here. Whether you're Jew or Gentile, anybody. Now, this is actually very significant. Because what it meant is that Gentiles could come in here and they could hear the singing of the psalms and the worship going on. But also, rabbis would sit in these porches, because that was out of the sun, a bit cooler, and they would teach people. So Gentiles would come into the temple and be taught the word of God. What they were not allowed to do was to go past this little wall here. This little wall here, it may be what Paul refers to in Ephesians as the dividing wall of hostility. And basically, nobody was allowed to go past there unless they were a Jew. And they could come up here to this gate here. This was the beautiful gate This is where the lame man was in the book of Acts, begging. It was a good place to beg, because lots and lots of people. That was the main way in to what was called the court of the women, which is this bit here. Then there's a set of, if you look very carefully, you can see there's a set of semicircular steps where they used to sing the Psalms. And you go up into the court of the men, which was quite a narrow bit, and then into the court of the priests here, before the holy place. And that's in that court of the priests is where the altar, the burnt offering was, and the places where they sacrificed the animals and things. So it's helpful just to have an idea here. Let's go on to the next one. Anybody, yes, if you're a proselyte, you're officially a Jew. So you could go in. Now remember, in the book of Acts, Paul gets accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple. And that's why he got arrested. That was not allowed. I don't think he did bring Gentiles into the temple. He probably brought them into the court of the Gentiles. That was okay. I shouldn't think he took them any further. But if you did go past that wall, you'd see this stone. This is actually one of the stones from the temple. And it was on the wall surrounding the sanctuary. And basically it says this: foreigners must not enter inside the balustrade or wall, or into the forecourt around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his ensuing death. And it was written in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, so anybody could understand it. And they've discovered quite a few of these. There's a view of the court of the women. So there's those semicircular steps. These doors here were called the Nicanor gates. And if you're lucky, if you go to the British Museum, they might let you into the basement, into the room which is hardly ever open. I haven't been there for years. But down there they have an ossuary, a bone box, and on there it's inscribed Nicanor, who made the gates. And it's the bone box of the person who gave the money to make those gates. These ones here, the beautiful gate, apparently needed 8 people to open them. They were so heavy. And they're made out of wood covered with gold. And one thing you find with the temple, it was all made out of marble and gold. And so when the sun came up, it would glisten on it, and it would like shine. And apparently people coming towards Jerusalem would say it's like seeing this huge mountain as you went up to Jerusalem, because it's so prominent, and it would shine in the sunshine, because it's all marble and gold. Over here is the treasury. And in the treasury, did you talk about this in Luke? Now, in the treasury, there were 13 boxes for the different offerings. And they were like a box, and it had an opening shaped like a trumpet. Now, in those days, of course, they didn't have notes or cards or checks or anything. And so if you wanted to give money to the temple, you had to give a coin. And the bigger the coin, the more it was worth. And so what people could do, if they had a big coin, they could throw it into this trumpet, and it would go, and everybody would say, oh, isn't he giving a lot of money? I remember Jesus was just standing in the temple watching. And then you see the widow came with her 2 mites. You know how big a mite was? It was about half the size of an English penny. They're really, really tiny, about this size. They don't make much noise when you put them in. It would go tick, something, it's a little tiny noise. And that's where the treasury was. And so it's helpful to get to know the temple a little bit. This is an inscription from the synagogue of the freedmen. Now, the freedmen were people who had been slaves. Another thing you've done, Philemon, did you talk about slavery? The institution of slavery back then, and how you became a slave, and how you could get out of being a slave. And most people were either born a slave, and you'd be given a name like Onesimus. Useful. Ha. In the book of Romans, when you read Romans, you'll find there's a family of slaves. There's somebody called Tertius. He's beeping at me. There's somebody called Tertius and somebody called Quartus. Now just imagine having children and calling them this. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Because that's what they are. Tertius, number 3, Quartus, number 4. They must have been slaves. A free person would never give their children a name like that. Can you imagine that? You imagine your mum and dad say, okay, you're number 1, you're number 2, number 3, number 4. How horrible, isn't it? But that's slavery, how degrading it was. Now, most people either were born a slave or you're a slave who captured prisoners. So they go to another country, capture a few people, bring them back and sell them. I always remember in Ephesus, when I visited there, you had the agora, the marketplace, where the slave market was. I remember sitting there thinking, one day, this guy called Philemon came down and made a purchase which he later regretted. Onesimus. Oh, Onesimus must be useful. But no, he wasn't. But then, yes, he was. You know the end of the story, by the way? Did you know the end of the story of Onesimus? What happened to Onesimus? He was freed, yes, but what happened later on? He did become leader of the church in Ephesus, but also it was in Ephesus that the letters of Paul were collected together towards the end of the first century. So who put the book of Philemon in the New Testament? Onesimus did. It was very valuable to him. Makes it a bit more personal, isn't it? Anyway, the synagogue of the freedmen, these are the people that Stephen had an argument with. And this is an inscription there from that synagogue. It's actually there in Greek. What's happened to Oh, there they go. Come back again. Okay, this is Damascus. I shouldn't think it looks anything like this now. I've not been. Anybody been to Syria? I've not been. Very ancient, archaeology and things, which is just basically being wiped out now. Sometimes people say, is it right that the British have all this stuff down in the British Museum? Well, I say, yes, it certainly is. Because if it wasn't here, it would be somewhere like Syria or Iraq, and it would have been destroyed. We keep it safe here. The British Museum is free to entry. People, thousands and millions of people can come and see it very easily. So I don't feel at all guilty of the fact we have all this stuff, which we basically pinched from Iraq and Syria. And you read the story. There's a very interesting story you can read about how they discovered all this Assyrian stuff in the British Museum. Basically, they pinched it and smuggled it out. Ferried it out down the river and got it out of the country before the officials knew what was happening. There's amazing stories, actually, as you read the account of how they discovered some of the actual artifacts, which you can now see in the British Museum. What was his name? It'll come to me. There's the name of the archaeologist who discovered it all. Anyway, Syria back then, Damascus, was an area called Nabatea. Back in the, if you have the map here, basically Rome conquered the coastal area, and further inland was this area called the Nabateans. They were the ones who are well known for the city of Petra. Have you seen Jordan? That one down in the rocks. But the Nabateans ruled that area, and apparently during the time that Paul visited, Nabatea ruled over Damascus under a king called Aretas. And Aretas actually gets a mention, I think it's in 2 Corinthians. But he was subject to Rome. Damascus was given to Aretas by the Emperor Caligula just before the time of Paul. Okay, that's the next one. Oh, I can't do the next one. I have to do it. Okay, so this is a little bit of a background now of what was going on. First of all, with the death of John the Baptist, but also with Paul visiting Damascus. Anyway, this is King Aretas, and he was called Aretas Philopatris. A lot of these kings used to have a name and then have a sort of nickname. So he was called Philopatris, friend of his people, of the Nabateans. Interesting, he's not a friend of Rome. Anyway, so apparently his daughter was originally married to Herod Antipas. And you remember the story? Antipas goes to visit Rome, where he meets his father, Philip. There were several Herod families. The Herod family, by the way, work out the family tree of the Herods. It's really quite difficult, isn't it? Herod the Great had about 9 wives, and about 4 or 5 of them had the same name. Mariamne was obviously the in name to have if you're going to marry Herod the Great. So it's very difficult to tell which Mariamne is which. But there's obviously more than one. Also, the problem you see with having lots of wives, you have lots of firstborn sons. So the big argument comes, okay, which one's going to be king next? No, it's me. No, I'm the first of this one. No, I'm the first of this one. So they had a huge big bust up and a big argument, and then the Romans had to decide. Anyway, so Antipas, you remember he was originally married to the daughter of Aretas, of the Nabateans, and then he went to Rome, and then he decides he liked Herodias, and Herodias decided she liked him, and Herodias, of course, was married to Herod Philip in Rome, and she left him and came back to Israel with him, and then along came John the Baptist and said, "It is not right for you to marry your brother's wife." And so what happened to John the Baptist? He got put in prison. Interesting being a... Anyway, so apparently when that happened, Aretas was really upset and declared war on Antipas because he'd basically ditched his daughter. Anyway, so King Aretas gets another couple of mentions. First of all, there in 2 Corinthians 11. And it says this, "In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands." 1 Corinthians 11. That's a... So when you have you done much Paul? You haven't done much Paul's letters yet, have you? Sometimes people don't like Paul very much. Anybody here don't like Paul? You think, "Oh, I don't think I'd like to meet Paul." Sometimes the girls have issues with Paul. But normally, once you read 2 Corinthians, you decide, "Oh, I feel very sorry for him." Because he has this big long section in chapter 11 where it talks about all the different things he suffered and the number of times he was shipwrecked. And by the way, this was written before the shipwreck in the book of Acts. So these are other times in his journeys that he got shipwrecked and beaten up, which are not mentioned in the book of Acts. So again, you see how selective Luke is being. Anyway, so Acts 9 says, "The disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket." Let me tell you something rather interesting about 2 Corinthians. You can store this away in your mind for when you come to it later on. Now, one thing you'll find later on in 2 Corinthians, about chapter 10 and 11, he starts boasting of all his failures. Do you remember that bit in Paul? When he talks about the thorn in the flesh, whatever that was, big debates that people have about that, and all the different times he got beaten up and left for dead and all this sort of thing. And the ultimate disaster in Paul's account there was being let down the wall in the basket. It was like the ultimate humiliation. Now the reason why, you think, "Oh, what's the big deal?" But the reason why is that if you were trying to conquer a city with walls around it, who would be the greatest hero? The greatest hero would be the first person up the wall. Okay, up the wall, facing all these enemies at the top, conquering, getting into the city and conquering it. That would be a great hero, wouldn't it? So Paul he sort of argues in the opposite. Instead of boasting in all his strengths and successes, he actually boasts in all his weaknesses, partly because there was a big problem in Corinth of these people he called super apostles. It was like he actually made up a word which doesn't exist in the Greek language to describe these people who thought they were so amazingly, incredibly spiritual. They were called super apostles, and they thought they were it. They thought they were as spiritual as you could possibly get. And so Paul comes against them in the opposite spirit, boasting in all his failings and weaknesses and saying it's the grace of God. It's a very powerful message, actually. But you see, what he does is, "I was let down the wall in a basket." It was like the ultimate humiliation. So put it in the context there a bit. Anyway, these are some coins with Aretas on there. There he is there. Okay, this is a chapel in the city gate of Damascus dedicated to Paul. Probably not there anymore. Probably got flattened, I should think. But there it is, and there's a carving of Paul being let down the wall in the basket. I don't know when this was built, but Damascus is a very ancient city. Okay, remember that later on, this guy called Agabus comes along and predicts there's going to be a famine. And this famine was actually really serious. And it's actually mentioned in quite a number of different history books. And Josephus mentions this. Have you talked about Josephus yet? A little bit. Josephus was an interesting character because he was a Jew, but he became pro-Roman. Partly because he lived through the fall of Jerusalem. Have you talked all about AD 70, I guess? He actually lived through, he was an eyewitness to what happened in AD 70. He was actually in Jerusalem during the siege and actually defected to the Romans part of the way through, and that's why he was given the name Flavius as a Roman honor. Whoops. But he actually has some very interesting connections with a lot of events in the New Testament and in the Old Testament anyway. This talks about somebody called Queen Helena. I don't know where Adabini is. Somewhere up in the northeast, I think. And basically, it talks about the famine, how this queen sent a whole load of food to Jerusalem to help. And there was another here. It says, Tiberius Alexandrus succeeded Fadus. These were the governors. Under these procurators, that great famine happened in Judea, in which Queen Helena brought corn in Egypt at great expense and distributed it to those who want. Fadus was a governor from 44 to 66. So the famine was around AD 46. And it says in the Acts it was during the reign of Claudius. Now this famine actually gets mentioned in British history. There's a long document called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. You may have heard of King Alfred the Great. The only thing he's famous for is burning the cakes. It's actually a bit more famous. He's actually a bit more significant than that. He was king. Basically, King Alfred the Great was the king of the southern part of England about 500 AD. And he basically got the armies of the southern part of England and pushed the Vikings back as far as Watling Street. Watling Street A5 was the international frontier between the Vikings, the Danelaw, these Scandinavians, and the Anglo-Saxons and the... Sorry? Yeah, you were, yes. I always remember we were in Norway. I was a bit naughty. It was about the time we were in Norway is when Milan organised this reconciliation march for the Crusades. And one of the Norwegians, the base leader, I think, was going on about how great the Vikings were. And I said, I really think the Norwegians need to come to England as a march of reconciliation to say sorry for what the Vikings did. And he was really angry with me. So they weren't that bad. They were. They just took over and ruled the whole of the north of England. Now today, in England, you may notice some of the place names. If you have any place ending BY, like Derby, Rugby, that's the boo, the Scandinavian for town. Boo, however you pronounce it. And you don't get that in the south of England. You only get it from here northwards. And it's a fascinating bit of history. One of the funny things with England is there's this huge divide between the north and the south. If you've been here any length of time, you begin to pick it up. The northerners think the southerners are all posh and wealthy, and the southerners think the northerners are all, they're mucky and they work in industry and do mucky stuff up the north, and there's a bit of a snob value. And there's a big debate you see in England. Where does the south become the north? Well, I think historically it's here, the A5, because that's where the Anglo-Saxons were in the south and the Vikings were in the north. Anyway, Alfred the Great mentions this in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, about the same AD 46, this great famine in Syria, which Luke mentions in his book. Bede was an English church leader. He lived up in Jarrow and up near Newcastle. And he wrote a book called The History of the English Church and People. It's quite an interesting book, actually, to read. And he mentions this as well. Suetonius describes this famine as well. Suetonius wrote a book called Lives of the 12 Caesars, about the different emperors. It's very, very straight down the line about what they did as well. You read what Nero did, and that you'll be, whoa. Anyway, he wrote about this. Tacitus also mentioned this famine as well. So that's something really quite widespread in the whole of that eastern part of the Mediterranean. Okay, there's some coins of Agrippa I. Remember, Agrippa I, he was the one in chapter 12 who gets struck down. But there's some there. Agrippa the Great. Now, one thing just to be aware of is that the rulers over Israel, the whole system changed a number of times. So you get Herod the Great ruling over the whole area. Then his sons, Antipas and Archelaus, it's divided up. Then they have governors during the time of Pontius Pilate. Then they go back to having a king again, in Agrippa chapter 12. Then they go back to having governors again. And then they go back to having kings again. And it chops and changes. Basically, Israel was an absolute pain in the neck for the Romans. It's like the worst province they had to try and govern. Because what the Romans did, they basically divided up their empire into these different provinces and had a different system of government in the provinces depending on how peaceable those provinces were. So if the province was fairly pro-Rome, they would just have a fairly light rule over it. Otherwise, if there were rebellious provinces like Israel, Judah, they'd have a much heavier rule over them. And that's why it was really difficult for Romans. Okay, this is what Josephus says about what happened in Acts chapter 12. And this is a bit, I'll basically summarize this a bit here. So Agrippa was putting on a show in Caesarea in order of the emperor, basically a bit of sucking up, a bit of flattery. The way things worked under the Romans is that basically what would happen is when the Romans conquered an area of territory, they would find some local leader and put them in charge. And they had two things they had to do. But one was to make sure they'd raised enough tax, and the other one is that they kept the peace. That's why Pontius Pilate was so worried about there being a riot. When you read about the account of the trials of Jesus, particularly in John's Gospel, you'll find he's really anxious about there being an uprising or a riot. It's happened a number of times in his rule already. And basically what happens if you're a governor and you have a riot and the Romans have to send the army in, guess what's going to happen to you? You're going to come, the emperor's going to say, come here. And whether you get let out, again, is doubtful. You'll probably get executed or banished somewhere. So it was really a bit of a tense pressure on these people to keep the peace. And so they're flatter the emperor. And he's putting on this show here. So he invited all the governors and things. And he put on a robe of silver with sort of silver thread in it. And apparently, when the sun came through the window, it shone on this robe with the silver in it. And it sort of glistened. And its sun shone on the silver, causing fear and trembling in the audience. And the flatterers cried out using words which were no good to him, addressing him as a god. And this is what they said to him, to Agrippa. Be gracious to us. Until now we have reverenced you as a man, but now we see you as more than of mortal character. In other words, they think he's a god. And apparently he rather liked this. Oh, I'm a god now, am I? And you see, the Romans, they had this sort of thinking that, emperors were gods. It's very much a sort of Eastern thing from the Eastern part of the empire, this whole idea of deifying their leaders. And apparently he looked up and saw an owl above him. And apparently he had been warned before that when he sees an owl, he's going to die. And he was struck down by severe pains in his abdomen, dying 5 days later at the age of 54. And that's the account you get in the book of Acts as well. Very similar. Okay, so chapter 13, we get the first of Paul's missionary journeys. Now, I always like to think of this. In chapter 13, you have the church in Antioch. This was a very significant church in the book of Acts, actually. We didn't get a huge mention of it, but Antioch is up here. There. Now, what's confusing, there's a whole load of different places called Antioch. Partly, the reason is you go back into the testamental period, you had the rulers called Antiochus. Have you talked to Antiochus Epiphanes? But they had a whole load of Antiochus, and they've tended to found cities called Antioch, named after themselves. It's like the whole load of Alexandrias as well. But anyway, so Antioch became the sending church for Paul's journeys up here. And it was quite a significant development in the story of the book of Acts, how when the church was breaking out of its Jewish roots and becoming to reach the Gentiles as well, this establishment of a Gentile sending church. Very significant. Anyway, so just imagine you're in church one morning, today, well, Sunday, and somebody has a prophetic word from God. I want you to send your chief pastor and chief elder out into the mission field. How many churches would obey that? Who's their chief one? Barnabas. You nearly said Paul then, didn't you? But Barnabas was the leader. Paul went with him. Sometimes people suggested it really should be Barnabas' first missionary journey, because he's like the main one as they go out. Okay, so the first journey, Paul and Barnabas are sent out, or Barnabas and Saul. And, they go to Cyprus, partly because that's Barnabas' home island. Up here to southern Turkey, and go inland up to another place called Antioch. This area is up here in the center here. It's called Pisidia. Now, the other confusing thing when you look at this whole thing of the book of Acts is that sometimes you get the Roman provinces named, and sometimes you get the older areas named. So all this area up here was in Galatia. That's the Roman province. But there was an earlier area down there called Pisidia. And they had their own language. And it was like a local region under and before the Romans. Anyway, so they go up to Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. Now, what we'll see in a minute, as we look at this in detail, that this here was actually the main road. There was a main road that went from Jerusalem, Syria area, up here through Tarsus, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, Ephesus, Rome. It was the main road. It was the M1. Okay? Now, notice what's happening. Where did Paul come from? Paul of Tarsus. Now, when you read chapter 13 and 14, basically he goes to these places. What happens in every single one of them? He gets rejected, beaten up, thrown out, stoned, left for dead. You name it, that will happen. So where does he go? What would you be tempted to do if you were here in Derby? I'm going home. The next place down the road is Tarsus. What does Paul do? He turns around and goes back. That's guts, isn't it? And he goes back the same way and then back to Antioch. That's the first journey. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. By the way, there's a little Roman boat I put on there. They're tiddly little tiny weeny things. There's the board for steering, controlled by sail there. There's a model of a ship. There's the figurehead, it's like some sort of swan. And there's the sails. They're only really quite tiny. You can get an idea how big they are compared to the size of the buildings. Would you like to go across the Mediterranean in one of those? No, thank you. Hardly bigger than the rowing boat, They're really tiny. A bit like, if you've been down to the canal up in Stoke Golding or somewhere. They're about that size. The narrow boats, that sort of size. Okay, Cyprus. There are two main places he went to in Cyprus. One was Salamis, the east coast, and one here, Paphos, on the west coast. Very historic. It's a place I'd like to go sometime, actually, Cyprus. Because nowadays the north is a bit difficult, but this is Salamis on the right-hand side here, and that's Paphos on the left-hand side. It was in Paphos that Paul met this magician and turned him blind. And the Roman governor, called Sergius Paulus, interesting, has the same name, was very impressed. Now, one of the things you'll find in the book of Acts, this little theme that comes through the book a number of times, is that where does the opposition come from? There's two sources of opposition in the book of Acts. Where does it come from? Jews. There's a little phrase you may notice, which is very unpolitically correct nowadays. But the Jews. Did you notice that little phrase? All sorts of great things are happening, but the Jews. I colour those in black on my colour coding. It's a recurring phrase, but the Jews. It's like, the bad guy, dung, 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 the sort of theme music, James Bond has just come out. You can have, imagine when the bad guy comes up, you have the special theme music, but that's but the Jew, dung, dung. But where does the other source of opposition come from? The devil, yeah, but through who? Magicians. And people who are into magic and this sort of stuff. Number of times. People who are into soothsaying, fortune telling. Did you notice those? Like Philippi, Cyprus, Remember, earlier on in the book of Acts, you get Simon the magician who wants to buy the power of the Holy Spirit. And Peter tells him off. By the way, that his name went into church history. Have you ever heard the word simony? Simony is basically when you buy church positions. Okay, you want to be Bishop of Nuneaton? Okay, that will cost you £2 million. You want to be Archbishop of Canterbury? That's £100 million. You want to be Pope? You want to be Pope? I'm not joking. This happened in history. People bought these offices, and that was called simony, named after Simon the magician. So he went down into history. But you see, the opposition from the Jews, but also from the magicians. And one thing you'll find is that Luke is quite interested in this whole thing of the spiritual battle between the gospel and the powers of darkness. You get it in his gospel, but you also get it in the book of Acts. You know, remember in Ephesus, why were they so upset with Paul? In Ephesus, they couldn't sell what? Little statues of Artemis. They made lots and lots of money selling these little statues of Artemis. The temple in Ephesus, Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. People used to tour around these like a sort of package holiday, 50 AD style. You know, TripAdvisor and Expedia and all these EasyJet, you know. But back then you'd walk or go by boat, but they'd used to tour around, and Ephesus was one of the main places. And they'd buy these little statues of Artemis made out of silver. And it talks. There's one place in 2 Timothy where it talks about this person who's a silversmith who caused so much problem, but he made these little statues of Artemis probably. So it's again this clash with these powers of darkness. And this is what you get in Cyprus. But when you get this opposition from the Jews particularly, we then see support and protection coming from the Roman governors a number of times. And this becomes quite significant. We'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow. Okay, this is an inscription they found naming Sergius Paulus, the governor of Cyprus, proconsul of Cyprus. Now, he was called a proconsul. And this is again an example of where Luke is extremely accurate with his account. He gets the titles of these different governors in the different provinces at the right time perfectly correct. Because sometimes, you see, a province would have one type of leader at one time, then it would change. But what you find is that Luke gets it consistently correct. And also you find different places, different cities had different titles for their leaders. Some are unique to particular towns, and we'll mention that as you go on. But anyway, this is a consul. And a proconsul was in charge of a senatorial province. This was a province under the control of the Senate. The Senate was like I wouldn't call it a parliament, because it wasn't elected. It was by birth, basically, you became a senator. But they were like the people who actually administered the rule of the emperor. And they were elected by the Senate for 1 year renewable term. And their job was to ensure the peace and collect taxes. They did not have a military authority. They did not control the army. But that was Sergius Paulus. There he is on that inscription. Okay, so we go inland now to Pisidia, Antioch. And what we have here, we have an example of Paul's preaching in the synagogue. Now, you're doing a little exercise on Paul's messages, aren't you? Because it's very interesting what he preaches. You know, the other thing also rather interesting is, would you have got saved by listening to them? If you read through those accounts, you think, would that speak to you? Now, because what does he do in Pisidian Antioch? He goes to the synagogue, and this was like his sort of pattern all the way through his ministry. He goes to the synagogue, and because he's a Jewish rabbi, he gets invited to speak. And by the way, when you taught in the synagogue, you would sit down. You'd normally stand up to read this passage, and then you'd sit down to talk. So, pass me the chair. No. And sometimes it's nice to sit down to teach. That's nice to do that. But they'd sit down to talk, and as a Jewish visiting rabbi, he'd be invited to teach. Now, the question, of course, with Paul is how long will they let him carry on? And you see, Paul's very clever. What does he do? Just imagine, you see, when you read Acts 13:14, just imagine you're a Jew or one of the Jewish leaders in that synagogue, and you've invited Paul to teach. It was a bit of a risk, isn't it, inviting somebody else to teach? Yeah, she's probably regretting it now. One thing you'll find with SBS is you'll get disasters, by the way. Be prepared for this. You're going to get things which are just go completely pear-shaped. I always remember once I had somebody visiting speak, and he started teaching, and it was completely the wrong book. We've got two books, and he got them the wrong way around. So all the students were ready for Hosea, and he started teaching Amos, and then he'd read Amos. Yeah. What did I do? You just have to go with it. And you couldn't really say, "Oh, sorry, wrong one." You'll find you'll identify with Paul in chapter 11, 1 Corinthians, all the disasters. I can tell you a few disasters. My worst one? Just imagine, this is the worst possible disaster you have on an SBS. And this actually happened. It's very sad, extremely sad, actually. We had one student who, very keen, served the Lord. And first term, she was okay. Second term, things started to go wrong. Started questioning all sorts of stuff, went to all sorts of things, and different people talked with her. And it was interesting what happened, what it was. Somebody eventually, I don't know what it was now, got to the root of it, what the actual problem was. Basically, she was in a big temper tantrum with God. And anyway, she decided she didn't believe in God anymore. And didn't want to follow God anymore, so she dropped out of the school. You know what happened next? She committed suicide. That's about the worst possible. That was my first school. Okay, so have you had that one? That was my baptism of fire, I'll tell you that, for leading a school. So that's what you get, leading schools full of students, and students come with all sorts of stuff, and some that you know about and some that you don't. One of the problems I had is that I'm a teacher, I'm not very good at leading. And that people get all sorts of things we go on in school. I didn't know about it. I was too busy getting things prepared to teach and things, But, I'm so glad I don't have to lead schools anymore. But, anyway, so things go wrong. So just imagine you are a Jew in the synagogue listening to Paul's talk. What does he do? He goes right back and gives them an Old Testament history lesson. Starts talking about Abraham and Moses. And you can imagine all these Jews just there, oh, yeah. Oh, this is good. And he gets up to David. And, oh, good. And then he suddenly drops them in it. He starts talking about Jesus. And then before they realize, what? Very clever, actually. And then what you find is that you get a very characteristic response. You get a few people who believe. They come to faith. Only a few. The majority oppose him, and they basically kick him out. And that's what happened again and again and again through his synagogues, through the book of Acts and the different synagogues. And what Luke's doing here is giving like a typical Jewish message that Paul gave. You don't get it in every single one because you don't need to. He probably gave a similar sort of message in different places. And so a few Jews responded, but you see, in the synagogue, there'll be a whole load of Gentiles who were God-fearers, how Luke calls them, he calls them God-fearers, but who had not become Jews, but they hear the message of Jesus and say, this is what we've been waiting for. This is, we can come and believe in God without all this legalistic stuff. Because they were attracted to Judaism because of the belief in the one true God rather than believing in Zeus and all these pagan gods. But also, they're attracted to the moral purity of Judaism, in contrast to the debauched Greek way of life. But they didn't like all the rules, all the laws. I don't blame them. And so they remained God-fearers. They would not go that whole way and come under the law. So when Paul came along, basically he pinched all their God-fearers, which caused them upset them even more. No wonder you get the opposition there. And so basically you get kicked out and you go down the marketplace. Now you see, Paul also, he's a fascinating character because he was Jewish, but he was Greek. He was totally Greek. He had a Greek name. He was a Roman citizen. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But also, he went against a lot of the Greek way of thinking. But what we have in the book of Acts, you have a fascinating insight into the Jewish world and into the Greek world, and how the gospel clashed against both of them. And one of the areas where it clashed against the Greek world is that Paul did the worst thing possible. He was going to be a Greek teacher. You know what he did? He worked. You can't possibly be a good teacher if you have to work for your own living, earn your own money. Because the Greeks separated this whole thing of the spiritual from the physical. Very, very significant to understand Greek way of thinking, which is very prevalent still today in the whole British education system and the whole Western education system. If you're going up through school, there's this huge great pressure. You must go to university. You must go to university. Because that's a better education. If you wanted to say, I want to become a carpenter, they say, oh, no, you need to go to university. And that's why nowadays they give degrees and you name it, all sorts of bizarre stuff, And totally unnecessarily, I think. I think, educationally we need to, have a lot more apprenticeships and things. People actually been trained in real skills. But see, the Greeks really looked down on that. Paul worked with his hands to earn his money. And that's looked down upon. And you'll find that particularly when you come to Corinthians, they're really looking down on Paul. He wasn't really a good teacher because he had to work. Anyway, so he went down to Gentiles, teach the Gentiles through his trade in the marketplace. And lots would respond. And then basically the Jews got together and kicked him out. And he would leave a church there to get on with it. And who's this church consisted of? You've got a few Jews, you've got a whole lot of God-fearers, and a great mass of pagan Gentiles who all responded to Jesus, all come to faith from all their different backgrounds. And basically Paul appoints elders in those churches, and that has to go on because he's been kicked out. No wonder there's a bit of problems. Now, one thing you'll find when you read these letters is that they're so real. They're timeless in many ways. The differences of backgrounds and peoples in the churches. So, just the leader of those churches. Did you do Titus? Titus, yeah, no. Titus is really funny because he went to Crete. And by the way, we went to Crete on holiday a couple of years ago, and I decided I disagreed with Paul. Because in Paul it says that the Cretans were evil beasts and lazy gluttons. And I thought the Cretans were quite nice, actually. They were very friendly and welcoming. And anyway, the facts have changed in a couple of thousand years. But basically what Paul does, he quotes one of these pagan Greek poets, which is rather interesting, and says, yes, that's true. And then he says to Titus, I want you to appoint elders in the churches from these people who are evil beasts and lazy gluttons. Because that's all your choice. If all the Cretans are evil beasts and lazy gluttons, you've got to appoint these lovely godly elders who are all together and with it. And yeah. I don't know. Probably, you name it.
Where did they get their education from the church? When the chapter
Yeah, it's fascinating. They didn't, probably. We know about Timothy. Timothy was half Jewish, half Greek.
What was the next
And Onesimus would be Greek. Totally Greek. Pagan background. Some people were quite highly educated. Slaves could actually be very highly educated. You could actually have the situation where your slave was more highly educated than the master. It's possible that Luke was a slave. Doctors were quite often slaves, apparently. Well, a funny thought, isn't it? Doctors. But apparently a doctor could be a slave. So it's great, but there's no answer to that. It really depended on who was around and who they could see had that potential. And no wonder Paul needs to keep in touch with these churches and go back to visit to basically keep them on the straight and narrow. Because they're trying to do this and they haven't even got the New Testament yet. Would you like that job? A mixture of zealous Jews God-fearers and pagan Gentiles all come to faith, all sorts of bizarre backgrounds, and you've been appointed leader, and all you've got is the Old Testament. It helps you understand why there are a few problems in those churches, don't you? Anyway, we need to stop in a minute. Let's just get to the end of the first journey anyway. That's Pisidia Antioch today. There's the Roman road that Paul would have walked along. Some of the time he's with Paul, some of the time he isn't.
But he was not an Organ.
No. And one of the interesting things with that is, well, where does he get his information from? Obviously, when he was there, he's an eyewitness. When it's a we did this, obviously he was there. Other times he probably got the information from Paul, because he worked with Paul, he's with Paul when Paul was in prison in Rome. That's probably when he wrote Acts. Paul was stuck in house arrest. Luke was down the road somewhere visiting and writing his Acts probably. But the earlier part, where did he get his information from? He probably talked to the different apostles. Did you talk about this with Luke? Where did he get his information from? The possibility he got from Mary, who also know about the birth narratives, what the angel said and things like that. And he probably talked with Peter, and he obviously met these people at different times probably, and because they travelled as well. There's, when you read Corinthians, it's obvious that Peter travels. He didn't just stay in Israel. I think what's happening is that by the time John wrote, the other three Gospels are already written and in circulation. And John was the very last person, probably, on the face of the earth who actually saw Jesus face to face. He was definitely the very last one of the 12. And he died. He's the only one to die of old age. And they reckon he was about 100, and he died about the year 100. And apparently, according to church stories, the tradition is that his friends urged him to write down his memories before he went. Because when he dies, he'll take all his memories with him. And that's why John's gospel is different from the others. We already had the other information, so it doesn't. But also, it's what the purpose of John's gospel is as well. As I say, all these people, the gospel writers also, are very selective. You know, they're picking out different events in the life of Jesus to communicate what they want to communicate. So we have to, you know, that in the end, at the end of John, it says, you know, if the whole world would fill the books if everything was written down about Jesus. And so, you know, John had to cut that down to 21 chapters, whatever.